The human face of war is often a map of exhaustion. It's in the hollowed cheeks, the thousand-yard stare, lout, the grim set of a jaw that has forgotten how to smile. Study the photographs of Japanese soldiers taken in the summer of 1945, lout, in the cloying jungle heat of New Guinea or on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and you will see this face, out. It is the face of men pushed beyond all reasonable limits of endurance. And yet, it is not a face of defeat, out. There is a resolve there, a terrifying patience, out. An acceptance of a reality that made no sense to the Allied soldiers facing them. To those American Marines and soldiers, lout, watching their friends die in droves to take a few more yards of worthless coral atoll, a single, screaming question repeated itself with every casualty: why? Why don't they just surrender? The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Nazi war machine was scrap metal. The combined might of the United States, the British Empire, lout, and the Soviet Union was now free to turn its full, unimaginable power onto this last remaining enemy. The Japanese home islands were blockaded, starving, out, and burning under a rain of firebombs that had already killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The strategic situation was not just hopeless, it was apocalyptic. And yet, fallout from the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo to the deepest bunker on a bypassed island, the message remained the same: fight on, lout. To the outside world, it seemed like madness, a collective suicide pact for an entire nation. But to understand this refusal, out, to truly grasp the why, we must discard our own cultural map. We must navigate a different moral and psychological landscape. One where surrender was not a tragic end to suffering, but the very beginning of a permanent, unbearable shame, out. This is not merely a story of military strategy. It is a story of a national psyche, forged in centuries of isolation, of a spiritual doctrine twisted into a weapon, and of a single, catastrophic miscalculation that locked an entire people into a trap of their own making. It is the story of the Pacific War, explained. Our journey begins not in 1945, at the bitter end, but in the middle of the terror, on a small, forgotten piece of ocean where the true nature of the coming storm first revealed itself. May 1943. The island of Attu, at the fog-shrouded tip of the Aleutian chain. Here, a force of about 500 Japanese soldiers, cut off from supply and reinforcement for weeks, made their final stand against 15,000 attacking Americans, out. The fighting was brutal, close, quarters combat in freezing mud and howling wind. As the American noose tightened, out, the remaining Japanese troops, perhaps 1,000 men, did something that stunned their enemies, out. They did not lay down their arms. They did not attempt a breakout. Instead, in a coordinated pre-dawn attack, out, they formed a human wave. Armed with little more than bayonets tied to sticks, grenades, and a furious, screaming desperation, they charged directly into American machine gun positions. It was less a military tactic than a ritual of death. When the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared out, only 28 Japanese soldiers remained alive, and they were too wounded to take their own lives. The Americans had witnessed, for the first time on such a scale, the phenomenon of the Gyokusai, the shattered jewel, the idea that it was more honorable to shatter in glorious defeat than to survive in disgrace. Attu was a telegram from a foreign conscience, loud, a message written in blood that few in the American high command fully understood. But the man who would bear the ultimate responsibility for deciphering it was already planning his next move, out. In a war room in Hawaii, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the calm, calculating commander of the Pacific Ocean areas, pinned a new set of islands on his vast map. The road to Japan, he knew, would be an island road, a bloody island by island crawl across the central Pacific. The next stepping stone was a tropical atoll called Tarawa. And it was here that the why of Japan's refusal to surrender would cease to be an abstract strategic question and become a visceral and traumatic reality for tens of thousands of American boys. For on Tarawa, the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Kiji Shibazaki, issued a statement to his garrison of over 800 men. He distilled the philosophy that would define the next 2 years of slaughter. It would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa, he boasted. But more importantly, he told his soldiers, "You must all die here. Your duty is to inflict as many casualties as you can. There is no retreat, no surrender." This was no longer the bold offensive spirit of 1941. This was a new doctrine, the Kentai Kessen, the decisive battle. But it was a decisive battle redefined. Since victory in the conventional sense was now impossible, the objective shifted. The goal was no longer to win the war. The goal was to make the cost of victory so unbearably high, so soaked in American blood, that the United States would lose the will to fight. They would sue for a negotiated peace, allowing Japan to retain its imperial system and its conquered territories. It was a strategy built on a fundamental gamble, that American resolve was weaker than Japanese suffering. To execute this strategy, they engineered hellscapes. They turned islands into fortified, interconnected tombs. On Tarawa, they did this with concrete, coconut logs, and coral sand. The American naval bombardment that November morning in 1943 was one of the most intense of the war up to that point. The commanders watching from the ships believed nothing could have survived on the small, flat island. They were wrong. As the first waves of Marines in their amphibious tractors churned toward the shore, a eerie silence fell. Then, from hundreds of hidden pillboxes, spider holes, and reinforced bunkers that had weathered the storm of steel, the entire island erupted with fire. It was a slaughterhouse. Landing craft were hit and exploded. Men drowned under the weight of their gear in deep holes carved by shells. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned on a narrow strip of sand with no cover, facing interlocking fields of machine, gunfire. The water turned red. For 76 hours, the Marines fought, bled, and died for every inch of that 2-mile-long island. They used flamethrowers and grenades to burn and blast the defenders out of their holes. In the end of the 800 Japanese defenders, only 17 surrendered. One was a wounded Korean laborer. The other 16 were too stunned or incapacitated to resist. All the rest, including Admiral Shibazaki, fought to the death. The Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties. When the news reached the American public, accompanied by graphic newsreel footage, there was a national shock. The price for a speck of land no one had heard of a week before was too high. The public demanded answers. But in the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the reaction was different. They saw not an American victory, but a validation. The ratio of casualties was acceptable. The American public's horror was the intended effect. The strategy was working. The trap was set. And the next island in the chain was bigger, more populated, and fortified on a scale that would make Tarawa look like a skirmish. Its name was Saipan, and on Saipan, the logic of no surrender would escape the military manuals and manifest in a way that would haunt the world out, proving that the greatest weapon Japan had was not its army or its navy, but the unbreakable will and the profound fear of its own people. The conquest of Saipan was not just a military objective. It was a psychological threshold. For the first time, American forces were assaulting an island that was considered pre-war Japanese territory out, part of the mandated islands administered from Tokyo. Its capture would bring Japan's inner defense perimeter crashing down and place the new, terrifying American weapon, the long-range B-29 Superfortress bomber, within striking distance of the Japanese homeland itself. The Japanese knew this. They poured 32,000 soldiers into the island's defenses out, commanded by the rigidly disciplined Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sate. His orders were the same: defend to the last man. But on Saipan, there were also over 20,000 Japanese civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, families who had settled there out. They had been fed a steady diet of propaganda by the Imperial army. They were told the Americans were demons, kichiku, brutes and devils who would torture, rape, and murder them without mercy. Surrender was painted not as an escape from war out, but as a descent into a fate worse than death. When the American landing came on June 15, 1944, it was a force of unimaginable power, over 800 ships disgorging 70,000 Marines and soldiers onto the beaches. The fighting was, as expected, ferocious and costly. But as the American line advanced out, pushing the Japanese defenders and the civilian population into the northern third of the island out, something new and horrifying began to happen. Soldiers and civilians, trapped together in caves along the jagged cliffs of Marpy Point, faced the final choice. And in their thousands, they chose death. Families huddled together. Parents, following the guidance of soldiers or their own indoctrinated beliefs out, would first kill their children. A grenade, a knife, a push off a cliff. Then, they would turn the weapon on themselves or leap hand in hand into the roiling Pacific. American troops, using loudspeakers and Japanese, American translators, pleaded with them to come out, that they would be given food and medical care, that no harm would come to them. Too often, their pleas were met with silence or with a grenade thrown from the cave mouth out. Some civilians who did try to surrender were shot in the back by Japanese soldiers. For the Americans witnessing this, it was a profound and unsettling shock. They had seen soldiers fight to the death. That was a military reality. But this was different. This was the systematic self-destruction of an entire society at the doorstep of capture. It proved out, beyond any doubt, that the Japanese government's will to resist was not confined to its military. It had been injected, like a toxin, into the very bloodstream of its people. The civilian mass suicides on Saipan were the ultimate expression of the no surrender doctrine out. And they sent a chilling message to Allied planners. If this is what happens on a remote island out, what horrors await when we invade the sacred soil of Japan itself? General Sate, wounded and knowing the end had come, performed the ritual seppuku, disembowelment, in his command cave. But before he did, he composed a final, defiant message to Tokyo. His words would echo through the halls of power. I pray for the eternal victory of the empire. Back in Tokyo, the fall of Saipan triggered a political earthquake. The government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of the war, collapsed. But the men who replaced him were not peacemakers. They were hardliners who saw only one path forward, doubling down. The lesson they took from Saipan was not that their strategy was doomed, but that the national will for sacrifice was even stronger than they had hoped. The stage was now set for the most brutal island battle of the entire Pacific War. A battle that would erase any last lingering doubts about Japanese tenacity and burn the WWII into the American consciousness with white, hot fury out. Its name was Iwo Jima, a tiny, volcanic speck of land just 8 square miles in size. Iwo Jima was strategically critical. It lay halfway between the B-29 bases in the Marianas and Tokyo. American planes bombing Japan needed it for emergency landings. Japanese radar and fighter planes based there were intercepting and harming the bomber streams. It had to be taken. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamechi Kuribayashi, was a different kind of samurai. He had served in America, understood its industrial might. He knew ahead on defense of the beaches was futile. So, he devised a new kind of hell. He abandoned the doctrine of defending at the water's edge. Instead, he ordered his 22,000 men to dig. They constructed a vast, hidden-out, subterranean city deep within the soft volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi and the island's rocky plateau. There were over 11 miles of tunnels, connecting over 500 fortified positions, pillboxes, blockhouses, and artillery emplacements, all mutually supporting, all virtually invisible from the air or sea. His orders were explicit. No man must die until he has killed 10 of the enemy. Your mission is to inflict maximum casualties. Every position must be defended to the last. When the American bombardment began in February 1945, it was the most sustained and powerful naval shelling of the war. Again, the commanders believed nothing could survive. Again, they were wrong. As the Marines landed on the black ash beaches on D-Day, February 19, they met light resistance. They pushed inland, feeling a sense of unease. They were in a killing zone. Then, from hidden apertures in the earth from the silent slopes of Suribachi at their backs, the entire island erupted. Artillery, mortar, and machine gunfire rained down from every direction. The soft ash made running impossible. Men sank to their knees. There was no cover. It was, in the words of one Marine, a nightmare in hell. The battle that followed was a relentless, grinding yard-by-yard extermination fought above and below the ground. It was a war of flamethrowers, grenades, and demolitions against an enemy that was rarely seen until the moment he fired. Marines would clear a bunker with explosive charges, only to be shot hours later from the same position by Japanese soldiers who had crawled back through the tunnels. The iconic flag, raising on Mount Suribachi on Day 5, was a moment of immense symbolic power for America. But it was not the halfway point of the battle. It had barely begun. The fighting in the northern part of the island, the Mategrinder, the amphitheater, and Bloody Gorge, was even worse. Kuribayashi's strategy was working with terrifying efficiency. He was bleeding the Marine Corps white. When the island was finally declared secure 36 days later, over 600-800 Americans were dead and 19,000 wounded. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest were killed, many sealed forever in their tunnels by demolition teams. Iwo Jima provided the final, bloody data point. The formula was now irrefutable. To invade the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, planned for the autumn of 1945, would incur casualties on a scale that staggered the mind. Military planners estimated between 250,000 and 1 million American dead, and Japanese military and civilian deaths in the tens of millions. after Iwo Jima and the concurrent, even more savage battle for Okinawa, where Japanese pilots began their suicidal kamikaze attacks and over 100 Zalozan civilians died. The why of Japan's refusal was no longer a mystery. It was a terrifying certainty, Lout. It was a culture of death woven into the fabric of the state, a spiritual commitment that valued honor above life, out, and a military strategy that saw national suicide as a viable bargaining chip. The American leadership now held two terrible truths in their hands. The first was the fanatical resistance they faced. The second was a new, unimaginably powerful weapon being readied in the desert of New Mexico. A weapon they believed might be the only key to breaking the Japanese will without sacrificing a generation of Americans on the beaches of Kyushu. But even with that weapon, the path to surrender would not be straight. It would require the near destruction of a nation, out, a frantic diplomatic scramble, and a single, unprecedented voice finally breaking a lifetime of silence to speak the unspeakable word, out. The spring of 1945 in Japan was a season of fire and ash. While the Imperial Army prepared for the glorious, final battle on the beaches, the American military had already found a way to bring the war directly to the heart of the empire, bypassing its armies and navies entirely. The strategy was simple, brutal, and born of a grim new calculus, out. If the Japanese people's will to resist was their greatest weapon, then that will must be broken, not just on distant islands, but in their very homes. The architect of this campaign was General Curtis LeMay, a blunt, cigar-chomping innovator of aerial warfare. He looked at the B-29 Superfortress, out, a technological marvel designed for high-altitude precision bombing, and saw its flaws. Over Japan, the jet stream made precision impossible. So LeMay made a radical decision. He stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns to carry more bombs. He ordered them to fly at low altitude, at night. And he changed their payload from high, explosive bombs to something far more primitive and terrifying. Clusters of M69 incendiary cylinders, napalm-filled sticks that burst into inextinguishable jelly, fire on impact, out. The target was not shipyards or munitions factories. The target was the Japanese city itself, a sprawling, densely packed tapestry of wood and paper houses, perfect tinder. The objective was to create a firestorm, a man-made hell where superheated winds would reach hurricane force, sucking the oxygen from the air and boiling water in canals. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, LeMay unleashed this new terror on Tokyo. Over 300 B-29s descended to under 7,000 feet and carpeted a 16-square-mile area of the city with 500,000 cylindrical firebombs. The result was an apocalypse. Flames shot thousands of feet into the air, visible from 150 miles away, out. The firestorm created its own weather, whipping winds that threw people and debris into the inferno, out. Civilians who fled to the Sumida River for safety found the water boiling, and the bridges they tried to cross were melted or blocked by panic-stricken crowds. By dawn, over 16 square miles of Tokyo were a smoldering, charred ruin. The official death toll was 100,000 people burned or suffocated in a single night. It was the single most destructive bombing raid in human history, worse than Dresden, worse than the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima 5 months later. In the weeks that followed, LeMay's bombers visited the same fate upon Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. Japan was being systematically burned to the ground. And yet, from the Japanese government, there was no whisper of peace. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, The six-man body that effectively ruled Japan remained locked in a paralyzing stalemate. They were divided into two factions. The first was the peace faction, a relative term, led by the elderly former Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki and the subtle diplomatic Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. This group knew the war was lost. Their goal was not unconditional surrender, but to find a way to end the war through negotiation, using the still neutral Soviet Union as an intermediary, in order to preserve the one thing they deemed non-negotiable, the kokutai, the national polity. The kokutai was a mystical concept, the very soul of Japan. It was the unique, divine, and unbroken line of emperors descended from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. To them, surrender that endangered the emperor's position or sovereignty was tantamount to the spiritual destruction of Japan itself. It was worse than physical annihilation. The second faction was the war faction, led by the army minister, General Korechika Anami, and the chiefs of the army and navy general staff, They acknowledged the desperate military situation, but insisted on fighting the decisive battle on Japanese soil. They clung to the Kentai-Kessen strategy, believing that a bloodbath for the Americans on the beaches of Kyushu would force the U.S. to offer acceptable terms. Their conditions for peace were fourfold: no occupation of the Japanese home islands. Japan would disarm its own troops. Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, and above all, the preservation of the imperial system. These were conditions they knew the Allies, who had publicly demanded. Unconditional surrender, at the Casablanca Conference, would never accept. So, they advocated for a fight to the finish, a jokosai for the entire nation of 100 million people. They spoke of the glorious death of the 100 million. Between these two irreconcilable positions sat the most enigmatic figure of all, Emperor Hirohito, a slight, bespectacled man who lived in the secluded ritualism of the Imperial Palace. He was not a dictator in the mold of Hitler or Mussolini. By tradition, the emperor was a passive arbiter, a living god who listened to the advice of his ministers and then gave his sacred sanction to a consensus decision, He rarely spoke in meetings, and his true thoughts were an inscrutable mystery, even to his closest advisors. The government was paralyzed. The cities were burning, and the military was planning a national suicide. This was the deadlock that existed in July 1945 as American leaders gathered in the quiet Berlin suburb of Potsdam. The successful test of the atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert on July 16th changed everything for President Harry Truman. He now possessed what he called the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. For some advisors, like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the bomb was a shocking opportunity, fallout, a weapon of such unimaginable horror that it might shock the Japanese leadership into surrender without an invasion, and perhaps even allow the emperor to stay as a figurehead to ensure order. For others, it was simply the ultimate military tool to end the war as quickly as possible. On July 26, the Potsdam Declaration was issued. Crafted to appeal to the Japanese peace faction, it was a final warning. It promised prompt and utter destruction if Japan did not surrender unconditionally. But it was also deliberately vague on the critical issue. It stated that Allied occupation would continue until there has been established in accordance with the freely expressed will of the Japanese people a peacefully inclined and responsible government. To the Americans, this left the door open for a constitutional monarchy, But to the Japanese military hardliners, the phrase, unconditional surrender, and the absence of any explicit guarantee for the emperor were unacceptable. They saw it as a demand for national extinction. Prime Suzuki, under pressure from the war faction, and perhaps misreading the Allied intent, held a press conference on July 28. He declared the Potsdam Declaration to be nothing more than a rehash of old proposals, and that the government would respond with mokusatsu. This was a fatal word. It could mean to kill with silence, to ignore, or it could mean to withhold comment. He intended the latter, a holding pattern while they waited for a reply from their ambassador in Moscow regarding Soviet mediation. But the Allied translators and the world heard the former Japan was rejecting the ultimatum. The door to a peaceful end, however narrow, was slammed shut. The decision now passed from diplomats to physicists. The order was sent. In the early morning darkness of August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, a uranium gun-type atomic bomb. Its primary target was the city of Hiroshima, a major military headquarters and logistics hub. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. A blinding flash, a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun, and a blast wave that leveled almost everything within a 2-mile radius. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. Thousands more would die later from radiation sickness. In Tokyo, the news was fragmentary at first. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. It seemed impossible. The army minister, General Inami, even suggested to the emperor it might just be a special conventional weapon. The war faction wanted to wait for a full report. They still clung to the hope of Soviet mediation. That hope died on August 8th, when the Soviet Union, as secretly agreed at Potsdam, declared war on Japan and launched a massive, devastating invasion of Manchuria. Japan's last desperate diplomatic card was not just withdrawn. It had become a dagger in their back. The military situation was now utterly hopeless. A 2-front war had become a 3-front catastrophe. And then, on August 9th, a second sun bloomed over the city of Nagasaki. Fat man. A plutonium implosion bomb killed another 40,000 people immediately. The message was now unambiguous: America could and would destroy Japan, city by city, with single planes. There would be no glorious decisive battle. There would only be silent, instantaneous annihilation. That evening, in an unprecedented meeting in the sweltering heat of the Imperial Palace air raid shelter, the Supreme Council met with the Emperor. The deadlock remained unbroken. Suzuki Togo and Navy Minister Yonai argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the one condition: the preservation of the imperial house. Inami and the 2 military chiefs refused. They insisted on 3 additional conditions: no occupation, self-disarmament, and self-trials. The meeting dragged on past midnight with no resolution. Finally, in the early hours of August 10th, Prime Suzuki did something never before done in Japanese history. He broke protocol. He turned to the silent, pale figure at the head of the table, the Emperor, and said, "I respectfully ask your Majesty to express your decision." Every eye turned to Hirohito. The room held its breath. The living god was about to speak his will. The Emperor's voice was soft, barely audible in the stifling bunker air. He spoke not as a warrior king, but as a man burdened with the vision of an ending. "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad," he began, "and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation, and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. He acknowledged the army's desire for a final, heroic fight, but stated the plain, unbearable truth: the military would not. Japan could no longer fight out. Its cities were ash, its navy gone, its people starving out. To continue was to ensure the obliteration of the Japanese race and the desecration of its civilization. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer, he said, his voice thickening with emotion out. The time has come when we must bear the unbearable. He gave his sacred sanction to the single condition: acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, laut, with the understanding that said declaration does not compromise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. It was not a demand out. It was a plea for a guarantee on the Kokutai. The war faction was shattered. In the face of the divine will, they could not openly object. General Anami, tears streaming down his face, bowed his head in acquiescence. The deadlock was broken by the one voice that could transcend it. But the will of a god did not instantly stop the machinery of a state built for death. As word of the decision leaked out, a cabal of young, fanatical army officers plotted a coup. They stormed the Imperial Palace on the night of August 14th, hoping to destroy the recording of the Emperor's surrender announcement and plunge the nation back into war. They failed out, hunted down by loyalists. That same morning, General Anami, the proud samurai who had advocated for 100 million deaths, performed seppuku. In his suicide note, laut, he apologized to the emperor for his failure and expressed hope his death would atone for the sins of the army. His was the last dramatic act of the old code, a final refusal in the face of the new reality. At noon on August 15th, the voice of the Tenno Haika, the heavenly sovereign, crackled over the radio airwaves for the first time in history, out. To a people who had never heard him speak, he delivered, in the archaic court language many struggled to understand, the news of their defeat. He asked them to endure the unendurable. He had transformed the act of surrender from a shameful military capitulation into a supreme, sacrificial act of imperial benevolence, a final order to his people to live. The war was over, laut. Japan's refusal to surrender was not born of madness, but of a logic imprisoned by its own premises, out. It was the tragic culmination of a culture that venerated honor above life, out. A strategy that gambled on an adversary's pain threshold, fallout, and a political system that could only be unlocked by a king who was also a prisoner. They refused until the very architecture of their world, the cities, the strategy, the hope of mediation, was vaporized out, leaving only the choice between a national death cult and the unbearable, necessary step of survival. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal instruments of surrender were signed. The Pacific War, which had begun with the roar of Zeros over Pearl Harbor, ended in a silent, solemn ceremony. A long, terrible silence had finally fallen, and in that silence a new and fragile world began out, built upon the ashes of the old and the profound, hard, one lesson of what happens when a nation forgets how to surrender.